the givenness of the natural world. You see, if I'm not essentially, in some sense, free of that first creation, how am I? I'm in no position to recreate it because I'm caught up in it. You see, it's an analog of speaking of Anaxagoras, which I don't know why I'm speaking of Anaxagoras. He's a very deep thinker. Anaxagoras, I think I told you in a different context. Anaxagoras is the guy for whom the world of our experience is infinitely divisible, in the sense that, unlike the atomist, there is no point beyond which you cannot make a further division. You can go all the way down, so to speak, dividing and dividing and dividing and dividing, and therefore there's an infinitely small and an infinitely large. But Anaxagoras says, mind is something apart from this infinitely divisible world, which we call the universe. Mind is something apart from that. Right? So he was already anticipating Aristotle, or Aristotle was being true to a basic Greek understanding that Anaxagoras was articulating. And why is mind apart from, or in Aristotelian terms, separate from, all the things which are infinitely large and small? Why is it? Because, says Anaxagoras, mind is that which accounts for the rotation of all things, all the infinite particles in the universe, which rotation creates the world of a large experience, right? Well, in order to rotate the universe, or the elements of the universe, what he's saying is mind cannot be mixed in with the universe, because it wouldn't have, if I use a crude metaphor, it wouldn't have the footing. Do you see? It wouldn't have a footing. It has to be outside of it in order to move it. See, it's really the seed of Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover there. It's only seminal, but it's the same basic point. Okay, so Descartes. See, now when I'm saying this, so Descartes, who's a humble guy whose pretenses don't appear to be Hegelian, who doesn't seem to be doesn't have a project of a substantial identity of the human and divine minds. Right? It's much more modest. It's much more the human mind in the Meditations is a likeness of. It's the image of God. Do you see? But that's as far as Descartes really wants to take it, because that's not his project, right? But what I'm getting at is that you see, both in the Greek sense, and you might say infinitely more so in the biblical sense, the God who either moves the world has to be apart from that which it's going to be the cause of the motion of, or a God that brings into existence, as the Christian God does, the Judeo-Christian God does, brings the world into existence ex nihilo, where there's no potentiality, do you see, has to be, as it were, altogether apart from not only the world qua moving something or other, but altogether apart from the world qua actually existing, you see. So Descartes, when I'm just trying to go back to Descartes, which I thought of in this... I know I thought of it because I'm speaking of order here at the top of page 420. All right, at the top of page 420, and I'm saying the recurring, the beginning in the very form of order. Well, the next thing that Descartes does, and I think I know I quote this in the Novitas Mundi, after he does his meditations, he then moves on to some of the further, more concrete implications, right? And one of the very famous things in Descartes, which I point out in Novitas Mundi, is that he says, speaking of being essentially free of the original creation, he says, well, when you're doing a scientific project and you want to understand things, that what you need to do is you need to compare one thing to another, and in order to compare them one to another, says Descartes, I mean, it's a bold idea. I mean, just absolutely, I mean, it's very, very matter of fact. What you want to do is you're going to line these things up in an order, and he says, even if you can't arrange them in any natural order, he says, even if it's a fictitious order, just put them in any order, right, that seems to make sense to you, whether it's natural or fictitious. Now, fictitious sounds like a light term, but fictitious is facio. It's an order that you make. Do you see? So the freedom of the transcendental consciousness from the get-go in Descartes to fabricate, you see, to make, or I'm saying more strictly, to remake, because he hasn't quite given up the givenness of the world, but to remake it, right? The freedom from the from the immediacy of the natural order. That's what's achieved by Descartes in principle. And that transcendental consciousness retains that freedom in principle from the natural order in various ways. And the thinking now occurring then is saying what? The thinking now occurring is said, well, that freedom from the givenness of from the original creation in the context in which we're using the term here, that freedom is now absolutely realized in the form of the thinking now occurring. Right? So much so that it is no longer, in principle, a matter of recreating the world, but it's a matter of creating or constructing the world in the form of the absolute now, right? In the form of time itself. Okay.
So you're saying, in a sense,
yeah.
in the paleontology makes it so that you're never committed to any prior order. The freedom is reborn in every moment. So if if the conditions are such that you need to scrap the model that's been working,
right.
you can scrap it and start again. You can repeat, but it's in each case it would be a free act.
In principle, because even the so-called commitment to the prior order in the absolute now is a free act. Yeah, that's right. So you could say the spontaneity of the firstness in Peirce has been incorporated into this absolute now, or into this absolute middle, or in the language of today's text, the absolute between. You see that is predicated of Yahweh in the text. All right. So it's not so again, it's not that one wants to not take seriously firstness, but firstness as it were something outside of, to say, as an absolute outside of the middle in this sense, right? Not on a par with the middle, but upon which the middle depends. That's what's transformed the thinking now occurring, right? So now we have, in effect, an absolute middle which has incorporated into itself, as it were, all right? Firstness and secondness, spontaneity and regularity are no longer poles, right? No longer alternatives to one another in the act of it. What I would now say, so now I'm thinking, so I'm big on Aristotle's notion of what I call the act of knowledge, the act of knowing, as opposed to the getting ready to know, all that reasoning and the research we do and so on. But the act of knowing is the act of knowing an individual. It's stressed in, it's stressed in No Testimony, but it comes up again because Dewey was a very smart guy, and Dewey understood implicitly the point that I'm making in the text. I'm not sure that many others understood it, but Dewey clearly understood that the function of science, despite what you might think from going to high school or even college, I guess, is not about a text full of interesting universal statements and so forth and so on. The function of science, Dewey understands. Well, I'll give you Dewey's version, then I'll show you how it relates to Aristotle. The function of science for Dewey, as we shall see later on in the text, the purpose of science is to produce new individuals. Individuals, meaning, in our language, particular entities, right?
Known things.
Yeah. So, right, but it's to produce them. So it's activity, and an activity centered on concrete individual entities and the production of new ones. All right, so that's all that part, the new part, and the production part, the fictioning part. You see, the making, the creating part, the constructing of new individual entities, the newness, the construction, fictive part of that. That's the modern part. But what takes us back to Aristotle, what the American pragmatists, they knew this. Peirce knew this, right? He sometimes compares himself to Aristotle. He thinks he's got a better contact with Aristotle than Hegel does. Hegel makes a similar claim, by the way. But the point being, the pragmatists are closer to the actual Aristotle because the particularity in Aristotle that Hegel complains of, do you see, is respected in the pragmatism, you see, which does not reduce the other in any final and simple sense to a self-centered consciousness. As I put it, it's a de-centered self-consciousness, if you want to put it that way, a pragmatic consciousness is. And it's de-centered in the sense that it perpetually has room for the irreducible otherness of the other, right? All right, let me just pause there. I want to go back to the text. So, again, yeah, sure, sure.
The act of knowledge in the now, does that always imply a context of action, of decision?
Yes, yes. Give me the first part of your question again. The first phrase. Does that?
You were talking about the act of knowledge in the now.
That's right. Okay.
And
yes.
There seems to be a movement involved in that, and
That's right. It's constructive. So the act of knowing. It's as you're asking the question, and I'm trying to respond to you. That's right, and it comes into my mind that it's analogous. I'm not surprised at this. Okay, it's analogous to the distinction which I make early on in comparing Thomas to Aristotle, again in Novitas Mundi, but it's running through here. The model of the transcendental form of natural reason, which is my label for what Thomas sets up, then appropriated, sans prescinding from nature, appropriated by Descartes. When Thomas sets up, in effect, the transcendental form of natural reason, he's modeling that on. I mean, it's not an arbitrary thing on his part. In other words, he understands that transcendental form of natural reason to be the created likeness of the mind of the God who creates. Now, if you look technically into the mind of that God, which you can do, by the way, in a way that you cannot do in Aristotle's unmoved movie, you can't open that mind up, right? There's no room in there. Sheer contact of it with itself. But the model of transcendental self-consciousness is the mind of the infinite reason of the Creator. And Thomas is very clear on this and very explicit on this, that whereas normally and this goes right back to Aristotle. For Aristotle, this was not just a pedestrian observation. This was central to what we're calling his metaphysics. In Aristotle's case, the presupposition, if I can put it that way, of knowledge is the existence of an object. Right? And so much so, by the way, that the existence of an object that's presupposed in all knowledge has got to be ultimately an eternal existence, because otherwise it doesn't really exist. Do you see? So the presupposition of the act of knowing, no matter how you slice it in Aristotle, is an eternally existing something or other. Put it another way, to get to the point I want to come back to, something that is uncreated. There's no need for a creator God, because God and everything else that really is timelessly eternal. Do you see? And therefore, all knowing presupposes the existence of its object, even if it's the God-knowing God. Right? But if it's the human knower knowing something, that individual something, qua essence, qua existent individuality, right? Qua essence now, is something eternal. You see? And if I put it in more modern terms, minimally, it's something that cannot be doubted. It can't be doubted, or you couldn't, in an Aristotelian universe, you couldn't even talk about knowing it. To doubt its existence. Okay, now, here's the point. When Thomas deals with the Creator God's mind, he says that, in effect, unlike our natural expectation that we know something that is there as the condition of our knowing it, the divine knowledge in Thomas, God's knowing, is creative of the world. In other words, that God knows the world. God's not going to be put, the Creator, ex nihilo, the omnipotent knower, is not going to be in the position of only being able to know the world if the world is there for it. You see? So the divine knowledge is creative. The divine, if I put it in John's Gospel terms, or in Greek terms, or in the terms that we often use, the logos, the Word of God, you say, is that the embodiment, as it were, of the divine intention by which God knows things other than God, and that intention and knowing things other than the divine mind is the being of those things. In other words, the being of those things does not precede the divine act of knowledge. So to put it real simple, the model for Descartes, and in some sense for the thinking now occurring, sans consciousness, sans self, the model goes back to the divine exemplary consciousness in Thomas, wherein to know is to bring into being. To know is to bring into being. To know is to create. Right? That. Okay. All right. So in a very different way, because I'm really commenting on the whole process of what we're doing here, but come back to this page 420. In the end of the fifth line, if before now Descartes doubted, and in that doubt founded thought in order, if then Kant doubted essentially, founding knowledge in a universal order, and if finally Hegel doubted absolutely, founding knowledge in the existing universal order, all right, so the difference there, there are a couple of levels of movement there, right? In other words, Descartes' project was rather modest and, as it were, rather limited, and so I'm saying he founds thought in order. And while I do speak of the human reason as and in fact I think he does speak of it as an instrument for all contingencies, a universal instrument for all contingencies, it's in Kant doubting essentially. You could understand, I don't know whether I say it, but Descartes doubting formally. Doubting essentially found the knowledge in a universal order, and that's the universal order of what for Kant is the world of necessity, the world of nature, the world which is the object of science. And if finally Hegel doubted absolutely, and here this is a very cryptic reference in effect to the overcoming of the dualism in Kant between the freedom of the moral realm and the necessity in Kant, the freedom that he restricts to the moral realm, that is the moral law operates in the context of human freedom. I can violate, and in fact I do. In fact, if I'm Kant, I understand I violate it all the time, unfortunately. I can violate the moral law, right? But I cannot violate the natural laws, right? So the natural laws operate by necessity, the moral laws operate by freedom, and that dualism of freedom and necessity is one way of understanding what it is that Hegel means to overcome in his unification. He wants the natural world to be understood absolutely as a function of freedom, right? That the so-called laws of nature are, in fact, freely produced by an absolute reason, right? So the reason in Kant, it has a kind of it's an ideal realm of ideas, and you might say guidelines for organizing human knowledge, but it in some sense is an abstraction from the concrete world of scientific understanding of natural objects. It guides the operations of science, ideally, but it kind of hangs apart, hangs back, hangs, as it were, somewhat out of reach, as do the noumenal phenomena, the substantial things, so that reason should be known as substance would be another way of understanding what Hegel is doing, right? That the merely formal role of reason in Kant is inadequate from Hegel's point of view, and the reason or the notion that things in themselves are not known or cannot be known, right? Hegel wants to say no. The world of time and space, the realm of natural objects, the realm of science in Kant, if I have the appearance, what I have in that appearance is the substance. I have the thing in itself. The thing in itself as such appears in Hegel. The noumenal as such is the world of time and space. And so, or another way of putting it, which is nice. I mean, I like it. I don't know how it strikes you, but that appearance is substantive. For Hegel, appearance is the true substance of things. Okay? So that the old dichotomy or the old dualism of phenomenal and noumenal, Hegel overcomes that. Okay, so I'm in effect, as I say, and somewhat cryptically referring to those things here, and coming back to the text, Hegel doubted absolutely founding knowledge in the existing universal order, and there you can see, using existence in that sense which I've tried to identify early on as the modern usage of the word existence, which has a rather special meaning, temporal spatial, right? Existence, right? It's the same way in which Kierkegaard paradoxically uses existence when he says it's an absolute paradox if you tell me that the eternal entered into time. That's like saying that the eternal exists, meaning that the eternal is temporal spatial. That the eternal could be in a world of change is a total contradiction in terms for Kierkegaard, right? So, but in Hegel, but the setup for Kierkegaard, of course, is Hegel, right? In the existing universal order, and if further, while Marx absolutely but non-categorically, this is just a kind of summary passage here of things that have gone on earlier in the text. While Marx absolutely but non-categorically, that is, not qua thinking, right? Remember we were saying that Marx he makes of thought a kind of tactical matter, right? He uses thought to accomplish where it's useful to do so. He uses thought to accomplish the ends of the revolution, but he's a materialist in a number of senses, obviously. But one sense in which he is a materialist is that in some sense he shares with Nietzsche some kind of contempt for thought. I have to be careful here, right? He's actually much more of a philosopher than Nietzsche is in the traditional sense of the word. But nevertheless, the bottom line for Marx is a kind of making of thinking or thought a kind of second-class instrument in the movement of the material nature, right? So in that sense, while he's an absolutist, and in that sense he's like Hegel, and also in his own way like the thinking now occurring, he's an absolutist, but in a way that brackets the categorical, that brackets thought, is what I'm referring to there. He doubted the existing universal order. The absolute doubt was doubted in essentially by Kierkegaard, Husserl, and Heidegger. If just before now the absolute doubt has been undoubtingly transcended by Derrida, another kind of cute way of saying that Derrida transcends the absolute doubt, but he does it undoubtingly. He transcends again by a kind of violence, by a kind of by a kind of deliberate thoughtlessness, a deliberate attack upon.
He brings into doubt precisely the basis of the necessity for the doubt.
Okay, all right, I'll take that. Yeah. And the absolute undoubtingly transcended by Altizer. Okay, now what that's kind of paradoxical. I think what I'm saying there, or one way of reading that, which I think is consistent with what I understand is going on in the Death of God theology. If the Death of God theology is, as I elsewhere characterize it at different times, the furthest possible extension of modern consciousness, and if as it were, the frustrating thing in the Death of God theology is that it is completely open to the possibility, just say, of there being certainly a new humanity, as he phrases it, or a new world, or right. But it remains open to that possibility, not to the actuality thereof. In other words, it's not open. It's not the actuality of a new humanity. The actuality of a new world is not transparently, immediately the identity of what would be the ego in the thinking now occurring. Do you see?
He's not proclaiming it.
Huh?
He's not proclaiming.
No, that's right. But he's willing to admit, or that admission, that sheer possibility, is the sense. If I read it back in this kind of convoluted language, the absolute undoubtedly transcended by. In other words, in his own way, the Death of God theology is transcending the undoubt, or to put it in the context of what you just said. Altizer gets beyond Derrida.
Well, he treats the Derridian undoubt faithfully. He doesn't have the second doubt is the ordinary theological sense of doubt. He actually has his faith, And with that faith, he gets beyond the undoubt of Derrida, which is certainly an unfaithful undoubt.
Okay, but does so in the language of this particular part of the sentence, unfortunately, from the point of view of the thinking now occurring, does so undoubtingly himself. Okay.
He's not doubting in the sense that he doesn't doubt his own faith, and he puts that faith to get beyond the kind of undoubt that's in Derrida, which is not a faithful undoubting at all. He doesn't doubt, but he only because he has a super doubt which doubts the basis of the doubt, but that doesn't lead him to faith, where it does lead Althusser to faith.
Yeah, whether it leads him there or it's the expression of his faith.
Yeah.
And I would just add, because I say it someplace somewhere in one of these texts, that a simple summary of the fact that there's intrinsically missing from the death of God theology this openness to in his language, what would be a definable and conceivable existing new humanity or new world. The way I characterize it quickly is that in Althusser what we have is faith in the negative. And that's kind of a pun because it applies in so many different ways, right? That the incarnation, the creation and the incarnation, the salvation of the world is the self-negation of that primordial transcendent Godhead in Althusser's reading, right? So he has a faith in the negative and a faith in negation, and his faith is a faith in the negative, right? It's an emptied out kind of faith where nothing. There's no refill, if I can put it that way, right? There's no.
I think you once said this, that it's like a photographic negative that hasn't been printed.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know whether I said that, but it's got potential. All right. So as opposed to all that stuff, now for the first time in history, in the form of existence, absolutely the name, the minimum, the proportion, the unum. So I'm saying in different contexts, of course, these can be specified, but essentially these are interchangeable notions here. The tetragrammaton, all of this, of course, is taking advantage of the preceding mathematical linguistic analysis. The absolute doubt is doubted essentially, founding thought in the existing universal order, founding knowledge in the transcendence of the existing universal order. And I want to pause there because I find what I'm doing here, and I'm not surprised at it, but I've always had the sense, and it was not a deliberate, although I guess it's implicit in, I think if you read what I have to say about Aristotle and Novitas Mundi, you get the feeling I have a very high regard for Aristotle. I don't think I ever say that Hegel says it, and I would agree with him. And so there's something lost in modernity of value in Aristotle, right? And here might be one example of that, and that is that for Aristotle there is a difference between thought and knowledge, or between thinking and the act of knowledge, right? And while in the thinking now occurring, we don't have a simple return to the rational psychology, or the epistemology of Aristotle. We don't. Right? Nevertheless, a distinction is being made here between thought and knowledge, right? Between the thought which is related to the existing universal order and the knowledge which is the transcendence of the existing universal order, right? And there is another way of my speaking in effect in the act of knowing that we've talked about here that occurs in the form of the absolute now. The transcendence of the existing universal order is analogous to what I was talking about before as the creation or the constructing, right, of the existing universal order. So if there is a distinction to be made between what Chuck was talking about a moment ago or a few minutes ago about the I forget how he phrased it, but the past order or the given order, as opposed to the intrinsic nature of the thinking now occurring, which is to construct order. That even that past order I was saying was nevertheless a free act, right? In other words, there's no, in that sense, there's no given. But if you make a distinction there between the order that is about to be, so to speak, or is being replaced by the new creation, you see, in the essence of the act of the thinking now occurring, then as far as that distinction goes, it's something analogous to the distinction in somebody like Aristotle between thought and the act of knowledge, right? Okay. So
in this middle of this long sentence here, I lose what is being doubted and what's not. You have the absolute doubt
right.
is doubted essentially, then comma, founding thought in the existing universal order.
Mm-hmm.
Is that continuously? Is that another thing that's being doubted essentially, or is that in contrast to what's being doubted essentially? And then you have founding knowledge in the transcendent. So in other words, if founding thought in the existing universal order, if that's part of what's doubted, then how is founding knowledge in the transcendence of the existing universal order, how is that not being doubted? And if it's not what's doubted, and if it's not what's doubted, how is there a contrast between the thought and the knowledge? That was my problem. You see what I'm saying? It's either, if they're not all doubted, then where's the contrast? If they are doubted.
Well, what is doubted essentially, what's being said is in the thinking now occurring, what is doubted essentially is the absolute doubt.
Yes.
Okay.
Then what about the next one?
All right. Then, and doubt, the essential doubting of the absolute doubt is, you could say, founding, is what it is to found thought in the existing universal order, and it is what is to found knowledge in the transcendence of the existing order. So both of those things follow. They are, as it were. I don't like the language. They are the result, or they are an expression of what it means. They are positive expressions, one distinguished from the other. Thought from knowledge. The existing universal order distinguished from the transcendence of the existing universal order. Those things are positive expressions of what it means to essentially doubt the absolute doubt. Right? All of which,
I got it.
Okay,
Yeah.
all of which is a roundabout way, but I want to go back to the foundation of modern thought in doubt. I mean, Descartes doubted. Okay,
so you're doubting that doubt.
Well, his doubt has been doubted before now.
Well, indeed.
Right? Okay, but it's been doubted constructively. That's what I'm saying. When Kant did his critique of Descartes, he wasn't saying Descartes made a mistake. Let's go back to Aristotle.
No,
he was saying Descartes made a mistake.
What can't we doubt that Descartes doubted?
Yeah, right. But Descartes has no doubt that when he says cogito sum, Descartes has no doubt that he's dealing with his substance.
Yeah.
And so he didn't doubt enough. You see? Yeah. And Kant says, hold it, in the critique. Yeah. He says, no, that you don't have a substantial knowledge of yourself in that self-certainty. What you can be self-certain of is yourself qua appearance, as opposed to substance, qua phenomenon. Yeah. Right? You see that?
And then what is it not possible to doubt? Those are the categories.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, let's not go there. All right. Okay. Yeah, they come up again in today's reading. So when Hegel comes along, he's not, again, he doesn't want to retreat from Kant, you see? But so Kant has doubted more thoroughly, put in simple terms. He's doubted more deeply than Descartes did, right? But he hasn't doubted deeply enough from Hegel's point of view. So Hegel wants to doubt as deeply as you possibly can, right? And so I think I affect here attributing to Hegel the notion of an absolute doubt, okay? Yeah. And I'm saying that between Hegel and the thinking now occurring, I had all these other guys trying to hone in on the act, Marx, Kierkegaard, Husserl, Derrida, Heidegger, and so on, and they're all trying to do what? They're trying to doubt the absolute doubt. And I'm saying, fine, they are doubting the absolute doubt, but they're not doing so essentially. See? So in that sense, I want to, if I can put it this way, just to be clear on it, I want to retrieve the truth of the past, minus its self-limitation. Right? It's limitation in subjectivity. Right?
So what is to doubt essentially? Like, how could you say that? I mean,
Well, to doubt essentially is to recognize, putting it positively, is to recognize the I want to see if I can state this precisely. To doubt essentially is to think the well, let me just start on it this way. To think the essentially creative the essentially creative, I want to say nature, but it's not the right word. The essential, also I'll repeat, the essentially creative essence. It's to think the essentially creative essence of consciousness. I think that's precise. There's a repetition of essence there, but it doesn't bother me too much. Or I could substitute, because I can do this in the thinking now occurring. It is to think the essentially creative existence of consciousness. Do you see? Because if what's being said is in fact what is the case, right? Then one is not. There's no way in which one can take apart essence and existence. Do you see? I can't tell whether. Are you signaling a question? Okay.
No.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Okay, yeah, so I'm sorry to interrupt your flow there.
That's all right.
I'm actually trying to get, let me ask another
Okay.
question about that then. So when I was trying to understand that phrase,
Right.
even though of course essentially it's been going on for a
Yeah,
few
yeah.
months now, this may sound slightly moronic, but the one way that I manage to understand that is that I think about something about no exceptions and taking it personally. And by that I don't mean like me as a person exactly, but like the consciousness that is thinking it is not accepted from what you're thinking about. So
Yes. I think that's right.
so like you're actually in the substance of it, and that's part of what it means. What is
Right.
what the thinking is essential in the sense that it's not thinking about something else that isn't here.
Correct.
Does
Right.
that make any sense at
Yes,
all?
it does. And in fact, later on today, hopefully,
Okay.
when we get to this question, which we've already raised, but we haven't really gone into it, the question was asked initially about the nature of the transcendental ego, and I'm distinguishing it in today's assignment from the notion of a synthetic unity of apperception in Kant over against the synthetic unity of perception in the context of thinking now occurring. And I wrote in the margin, so I'm doing this now, I'm getting into the habit of giving away the punchlines.
Well, that's good.
The punchline will be, which is not in the text exactly, explicitly, is that what's going on in the thinking now occurring is the incarnation of the transcendental ego, which is exactly what you just said.
Yeah. Right.
You got it?
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Oh,
Right?
Yeah, right.
So,
that was the punchline another time
Yeah.
too, right?
I don't remember saying it that way before, but okay.
Yeah, I don't remember either.
All right.
Exactly.
So,
Okay,
but that's-
so now that's very helpful.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm
All right.
in the right universe. Okay, so what were we
Okay, let's see. Now, all right. And
essentially categorized?
I was interested to note at the bottom of this page 420. So then now I'm kind of reviewing this this question of what the various forms of doubt.
I mean, I'm sorry. In a second, you're going to say, the knowledge of what is transcendent absolutely doubted. It is precisely
Right.
this doubt, that of the knowledge of what is transcendent, which the Cartesian doubt was essentially not.
Correct.
So that with each advance on the Cartesian doubt, essential doubt, absolute contingency, blah, 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 that's where we're going. Modernity
Yeah.
moves further and further away from that substance of which in its origin it is the formal... But all of this seems to be saying that continuous with all of this, all of these things don't doubt enough.
Yes, that's right.
But how is
That the various attempts, both it gets a little complicated, right? Because it's both positive and negative. I mean, the attempts are not all positive attempts. Some of the attempts are negations of positive moves. For example, in Kierkegaard, right? Kierkegaard writes a book, a major book. It may be his major book. I don't know. The concluding unscientific postscript. This is not an accident, and it's not a careless bravado on his part, right? He means to write a book of what you might call a philosophical text, which is non-philosophical. I mean, he's undoing, right? And that's the text, by the way. It's a great book. If you haven't read it, you should read it. And at the end of the book, now I can't do justice, he does it very delicately, he's a great writer. At the end of the book, he basically says, what was that one on Saturday Night Live, the one who died of cancer, who picked her nose on the, remember on the news?
Radner?
Roxana
Yeah.
Bandana Banana.
Yeah, but her character, Rosanna Bandana, whatever,
Yeah.
and she would go on, somebody would ask her a question and she would misunderstand and go on at great length and then finally get interrupted. And when it became clear to her that she had misunderstood the question, she would always end her punchline, never mind. Okay. Well, if you read the concluding unscientific postscript, with a little more class, Kierkegaard writes this 600 page book. It's a big book, and it's a profound book. And at the end, he basically says in the last appendix to the appendix or whatever, he says, never mind. In other words,
If you agree with this, you didn't get it.
well, or if you agree with this, there was no point in writing the book. I mean, you're right. You know what I'm saying? Now, of course, it's as Kierkegaard would enjoy. I mean, it's the highest possible irony. Okay. Now, the thinking now occurring, while it appreciates the irony, the magnificent irony of Kierkegaard's project, doesn't share that irony. The thinking now occurring is a little more gullible, a little more naive. It's kind of absolutely naive, right? So it has, in that sense, so in other words, Althuizer didn't invent what I call his faith in the negative, right? There's already a setup in the negative form of Kierkegaard's faith. It's not the same thing as Althuizer's negativity, but it is negative vis-a-vis science. It is negative vis-a-vis reason. It is negative vis-a-vis knowing. You see? So I just want to flesh out a little bit one example of how, which is also would be obvious in the case of Derrida and so forth, that this series of labels of the various ways in which these guys are doubting is a little complicated because some of the doubt is constructive in the positive sense and some of it is negative. Anyway, but I want to come to the point there where so the basic clause of that complicated sentence is that because there was never from the get-go an essential doubt involved, no matter what magnification of the doubting goes on between Descartes and Kant, between Kant and Hegel, between Kant and Hegel and Kierkegaard and so on, all of that is a kind of an enrichment, a kind of working out of the doubt. But because there was something, it reminds me, now this is analogous to Kierkegaard. It's not Kierkegaard's point, I don't think exactly. But remember Kierkegaard says, you can sew and sew and sew, but if you forget to put a knot in the thread, you've done a lot of sewing, you see, but it's useless because it'll unravel, okay? And so what I'm saying is that, analogous to Kierkegaard's metaphor, that there's a knot missing in the modern project, right? But actually it's a little more dialectical than that. It's not that there's a knot missing, but I really probably would say that the problem with this fabric is that there is a knot in the negative sense of a knot. You don't have a knot in your hair. And there's a knot in the design, and that knot is the self. To say so, in that sense, the doubt was not essential.
You can't unravel it because of the knot.
Well, it reverses the metaphor. In other words, you can unravel it, but here, if you could unravel it, that would be progress. In other words, instead of a schema, something you can, instead of a garment that you have created that is not quite the reality, that is the picture of reality, or that is perhaps a window on reality, and so forth, to use the language of this chapter, this section. I want to take the missing knot, which is a positive thing in Kierkegaard. I want to turn it into an existing knot in the progress of modern self-consciousness, where that existing knot is a negative, where we would be better off without that knot, because that knot is the self. And what does the self mean? Among other things, it means this kind of continuity. It means the knot from the get-go being altogether freed of that first creation. So, in other words, the self-consciousness, the self-centeredness of the consciousness that frees itself from the givenness of the natural world, which would have blown Aristotle's mind. Right? He just absolutely could not comprehend that. The knot in that self-consciousness that frees itself from the natural world in order to reconstruct it. The reflection of the limitation of that abstract movement is the self itself. It's the self-centeredness. If the project had been to create the world, right, which I'm not saying it could have occurred to Descartes to set it up this way, okay, but just hypothetically, if the project had been to create the world in a way that was now I'll speak a little Hegelian here, thoroughgoingly consistent with the exemplary creative mind of the omnipotent God, do you see? There would have been no room for self-consciousness. In other words, self-consciousness would have had to been the thinking now occurring. It would have had to have gotten to it right away. Its relationship to the world would not have been a distance relationship, an abstraction from nature, you see? And so in that sense, it would not have in that sense, it would have essentially doubted. That thinking of the world would have been an essential doubt, right? And so it was not essential; it was merely formal.
But it's
right.
in terms of the sentence.
Right.
What you say, it is the knowledge of what is transcendent, absolutely doubted. So in this case, knowledge of what is transcendent stands for self. Because in other words, what you're doing is you parsed all of this history of doubt as, in fact, being a failure to doubt the self, which is, of course, true of the Cartesian situation and everything that follows. But
I don't think I said a failure to doubt the self. The failure to thoroughly doubt. In this context, the knowledge of what is transcendent. This doubt, that is, the doubt of the knowledge of what is transcendent. That doubt was not essential in Descartes.
Okay, but what is transcendent there? God or the
No, the world. The world.
The world. Okay.
The world. The universe.
I see. So the doubt of So the Cartesian doubt, which doubts the world, is not essential.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right. And the evidence of that within the doubt, the negative knot with a K-N-O-T, right? I have to spell it out.
Okay.
The negative knot is that, which is the evidence of the inessentiality of the doubt of the world, the doubting of the world, is the self that is the center of this consciousness, right? It's the self-reference, right? Because the self-reference, what I was about to say was, and I've said this in other contexts, that self has a number of connotations. What is a self is always an interesting question. But one of the connotations of self is this notion of continuity, you see? So when I have a notion of identity that is identically change, that is not averse to change, that is not immune from change, that is not, right? So, which in that sense, the I that is change itself is not a self, and therefore it is in the context of thinking now occurring, it is perpetually new. It's perpetually a novelty. Right? Maybe a better way of putting it, or better, another way of putting that, translate the Latin to English. It's the I that is the identity of transcendence itself is perpetually new existence. And I might also say then, another way of phrasing that to bring out another aspect of that same immediacy, it's an essentially new existence. Right? So the existence of the I is essentially new. Right? And in that sense, altogether incompatible with the notion of self, where self inextricably is bound up with the notion of some sort of continuity, some kind of sameness. Right? In addition to the other problem of self, which is self as opposed to other. So self, whether you do it horizontally or vertically, self is a problematic notion of person that is left behind when we come to the thinking now occurring, and for those kinds of reasons. All right, so speaking of the self, let me just finish this sentence off toward the bottom of 420. Let's get down to here. All right, so all of these forms of doubt, I say, in all of the progress that modernity, all the progress it makes, nevertheless is moving further because it doesn't have this essential doubt, because it has this negative not, moves further and further away from that substance of which in its origin it is the formal recollection, and in its infinite progress remains essentially unable to doubt essentially what it doubts absolutely, remains a thinking the essential form of which is to lack unity, to lack existence, precisely and absolutely insofar as it does not lack self, or where it either does or would lack self. And there I'm thinking of Derrida and Althusser probably respectively there. It neither does nor can lack the category of self, or the self essentially, neither can nor does think the other absolutely and essentially without self-reference, think categorically the absolute not self. And then I say further down on that page, when I start getting back into some of this Hebrew analysis, let's jump to the middle of the page, a little above the middle of the page, after the colon, full colon, the absolute recurring of the beginning of the proportion in the form of cathecological absolute novelty, the absolutely unconditioned recurring of the absolute beginning. So it's right, actually begins, or being occurs for the first time in every now, from the previous pages. The absolute unity of the window, identically the transcendent appearance qua absolute. I think I anticipated this earlier. So a simple way of putting that last notion is that in the thinking now occurring, the window is identical with the appearance, right? Which is to say, in the language of another level of analysis, in the thinking now occurring, you might say what would have been or what was the schema, you say, is identical with the reality. Right? But in a dynamic and active sense, right? If the schema is something that we create in order to understand something, then if the schema is identical with reality, then we've cut out the middleman in the sense of an extension. You see, so the creation of the schema and the creation of the reality are one and the same thing. Right? That's a positive formulation of what is being talked about here as an essential doubt, a doubt which is absolutely without self-reference, right? Absolutely open to the other, and then I really want to say, and absolutely open to the other as absolute, qua absolute, absolutely open to the absolute other, and that gives you the arena, if that's the right word, it's the wrong word, for a perfectly free interaction.
Because the absolute other is being created by the schema without self.
Yes.
Without there being a self,
Right.
that's the
Right.
reference that's doing the schema creation. So that's why the fourthness, to jump ahead,
Okay.
can function as the actuality of the force of resistance, rather than just the force of resistance relative to the firstness of the self.
I think so. I think you're right. I think that's right. As you were talking, I was thinking, my mind went right back to Descartes and to say that the absence of the self creates this perfect free relation among actually existing persons, And over against Descartes, the order is not an order of comparison. Not an order of comparison.
I mean, the in this list previously of synonyms, name, minimum, proportion,
Right.
tetragrammaton, the one that I'm still not understanding is the proportion. But I've begun to propose that to myself.
Okay.
And would that have to do with the sense of no comparison? That in other words, the proportion ordinarily is comparison par excellence. A is to B is C is to D. That's a comparison,
Right?
You know, in which there's only one. There's only a yes or no answer. Namely, if it comes out 1, it's yes. If it doesn't come out 1, it's no. There aren't any
Good.
1.5,
And we noted right away when
7.7.
we got into this that it doesn't work in the thinking now occurring because we keep coming up with all these proofs that aren't 1.
Yeah, right.
And if we come up with 1, we don't. In fact, sometimes we come up with 1, like in today's reading. I think we come up with 1, and then we would suspect that this isn't the one that we would come up with previously. It's a different one. Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
That's
okay,
right.
So the sense of no comparison, of each one being its own. You're going to get in a second to this square with a cross in the center of a circle, and each thing absolutely being that circle with the square in the center. That allows each thing to be what it is, independently of the consequence of the proportion that it establishes in relationship to something else.
Well, another way of putting it, to go back to the normal mathematics where you prove a proportion, you either get, as you say, you either get 1 or you either get truth or falsity. You either get 1 or it's not a true proportion.
Yeah.
So you're right. If we have a proportionality here and we're working it out all the time this way, right, in which you don't have to get 1, and if you get 1, it probably doesn't have the same significance it would have had, then that's non-comparative. Okay, and another way of putting it is that the reason I'm talking about absolute particularity as being a kind of perfect freedom or a polyontology is that the lack of comparison as the foundation of the order, the essentially non-comparative nature of the order, allows for this perfect differentiation, because it means, the point being, you could have perfect differentiation if you had in the current scientific sense of the word, and that's why I hesitated when I borrowed this phrase into our dialogue some months back, parallel universes. If you meant by parallel universes what I think they mean in quantum theory, universes that are just existing alongside one another but are not really interconnected, right? They're not
Absolutely not connected.
Yeah, they're not part of right. Yeah. No. But when I'm talking about parallel universes, by analogy, right, which is probably dangerous, what I'm saying is that here's a set of relationships in an infinitely differentiated reality, where in order to be in relation, one does not have to conform to some totalizing structure. Do you see? The absence of that self-centered notion of totality, do you see, which subordinates, in order to participate, right, in that notion of self-centered totality, you have to fit in, you have to work in the proportion. Do you see? Whereas here we get proportions that produce, you could say, unpredictable, in a certain sense, right? Certainly compared to the traditional notion, a mathematical notion of proportion, either 1 or it's wrong. This is an unpredictable set of relationships that produces a positive, intelligible result, and that's possible not because these things are not actually related, but they're actually related in a context in which there is no pre-existing
syntax
result. Yeah, pre-existing syntax perhaps, or pre-existing result. I'm now thinking of Hegel, who insists, right, that the result is the beginning, or that the beginning is the result. And and here it's being said, not that there is, in no sense of the word, a result, but in that sense of the word, it's not pre-existing, in the sense that it is that into which the parts must fit in order to be validly related to one another.
Once again, the absence of schema.
Okay. Well,
But it's-
absence of schema in the abstract sense. That's right.
But listen, why?
But it's a transformed schema which is existence, in the sense that this is a active construction on the part of consciousness. Right?
Why is it that the favored mode of relation is the proportion, as opposed to, for instance, contiguity, juxtaposition? You know, you are there next to the table, under the ceiling. That doesn't have anything to do with proportion. I mean,
I think proportion has to do. It's interesting. I mean, my immediate response is that proportion, in my mind, as it were, the essence of it has to do with relation.
All right.
So, all right.
This is the way it feels to me. It feels to me that holding to the idea of proportion is just like holding to the idea of the self in the negative. It's like you seem to feel that in order for relation to be established, it has to be in the form of a proportion, even though it's these weird proportions rather than the limited proportions of ordinary mathematics. But it seems to me that there's another way in which you get the independence and the sense that every entity is identically itself and not dependent upon its relationship to others, but is in relationship to others, and that's just by contiguity, we are next to each other. We exist contingently next to each other, and that contingency establishes the way we are with each other. There isn't a comparison implied by he's over here, I'm over here, you're over there. There's no pre-existent syntax. There is a syntax that's established by the absolute spatiality. Here's the table, we're on different sides of it. So there is relation, there is autonomy, there is...
Okay.
Right, so...
Autonomy is an old-fashioned word.
Well, all right, or whatever, but...
There's metonymy, okay.
Okay, but you see what I'm saying? I don't get where proportion has a favored... It's not like
proportion...
Leahy is to him, as him is to him. Where does that come in?
Proportion is made up of ratios.
Yeah, I know.
So ratio would be Thomas Aquinas' translation of logos. So what proportion means is not just relation, but rational or intelligible or logical relation. Now, the problem would be, and this goes back to the peculiarity of the real trinary logic, that when I've been conditioned, I habitually think, when I think logic, I think of some sort of pre-existent system for calculating something, you see? But as I tried to show you in a couple of little examples, that the peculiarity of the thinking now occurring is that give me 4 digits, put 1 on one side of the equal sign and put 3 on the other side and put 1 under a dividing line and so forth, and I can solve that equation according to the rules of the thinking now occurring in the real trinary logic. I can solve that in, depending on the particulars, probably in 2 different ways. Yeah, not uncommonly in 2 different ways, and therefore there's no so proportion means to me rationality. It means logicality, but it's understood implicitly, if not explicitly, in the context that the proportionality, the logicality, the rationality here is the rationality that has exploded to fit the form of faith, as it says in the preface. In other words, this is an essentially new form of reason.
Okay, I know that's what you want.
Yeah.
I'm not yet there that I get it.
Well, that's a distinguishable issue, whether you're there or not. But as long as you understand,
I understand what what we're trying to understand how you get there.
Okay.
We're getting closer, but
okay. Yeah, all right. Okay. I have this. My conscience tells me we got to get into today's assignment, and I just want to hit. I've already given this one away, but I just want to point it out where I was thinking. You probably know on page 423 and following, where I'm quoting Heidegger and time there.
I'm afraid you didn't. You had something you wanted to say in the middle of 421.
Okay, I cut myself off. 421.
You said in the middle of the paragraph after the absolute, or maybe you did.
You're at the absolute unity of the window.
Yeah, I think I did say that's appearance itself. That, in other words,
you did that.
The identification of appearance and the window.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, which would be analogous to the identification of reality and the schema, if you will. Right? All right. Okay, I just wanted to note that at the end of the last assignment there with the Heidegger quotations, where he says, that was the one I couldn't remember last time in class without looking at the book. On page 424, in the quotation from Heidegger, just about the middle, a little above the middle, he says, time is therefore originally this expectance, retention, and making present. So the equivalent of expectance would be future-oriented in other language, retention, past-oriented, and then his version of the now or the middle, right, is making present. Notice already in Heidegger, speaking of some form of the forms of anticipation of the thinking now occurring, he doesn't simply say the present. He says the making present. All right, there's already the sense of a constructive, creative aspect already in Heidegger. You see,
that's the way that in other translations is what's given as presencing. Right?
Okay, all right, yeah. But presencing is an active. That's what I'm getting at. It's active, and the thinking now occurring is saying, okay, fine, okay. But Heidegger's work is all, in some fundamental sense, is what Sartre objects to. He's retreated in a way analogous to, but in important ways different from. But in a sense, he's like Levinas, or Levinas is like him, in that they are both of them operating in some form of preconsciousness realm. You see, of Dasein, as he would call it. So to get the imperative, right, what I call the absolute imperative to exist. To get the imperative out of Levinas and bring it into consciousness, bring it into the realm of consciousness, to get the action, the necessity of action that's in Heidegger's understanding, to get that out of a pre-consciousness realm into the realm of consciousness. And so what I said last time by way of the punchline, it occurred to me in rereading this particular section in the light, again, of our dialogue, you see, where some weeks or months back we hit upon the notion of a productive receptivity, right? Which we said, interesting enough, Kierkegaard had a notion of what I'm calling, I mean, he didn't phrase it exactly that way, but basically he said that, where for him, Kierkegaard would have said receptivity in spiritual matters is productive. Do you say? And we said, well, fine, but there again you have that dualism. So you got another form of this dualism. How about a productive receptivity, where in a context in which this distinction between spirit and nature, which is Kierkegaard's reflection of the dualism in Kant between the moral, and for Kant it would be Kant's version of the spiritual realm, not quite as off the wall as Kierkegaard's version, okay, but nevertheless fundamentally the same basic kind of dichotomy, is also over against nature, the realm of science and knowledge and so forth and so on, all right? So the productive receptivity here is the language of the thinking now occurring in order to explain the form. In other words, when I get rid of the self or the ego as self, I think we are conditioned to think that the only way the I could be productive if it was some kind of a self, if it had a project. You see, if it was not simply receptive, because in self-consciousness, receptivity would be immediately read as passivity, as a lack of activity, right? But in the thinking now occurring, the productive receptivity is another way of articulating what is being said when it is said that the I is absolutely constructing the world, right? And I would like to say, but I can't do it in good philosophical conscience, I would like to say the I is absolutely presencing, you see? But it isn't presencing, you see? It isn't creating a distance. It's not bringing something before it, as if either that thing even if the thing is being brought into being, let's say, in the notion of presencing, the implication would be that there's an I there, right, which as it were pre-exists the presencing, right? You see, and then but the thinking now occurring, I cannot separate the I temporally or spatially in any way whatsoever. I cannot take it apart from the actual content. I cannot take it apart from transcendence itself. I can't take it apart from the act of construction. So maybe a nice way of putting it is that the ego in the thinking now occurring is the act of construction. Okay? And that's what I'm going to mean when I get to that part in the text where I've already prefigured that what would be a transcendental ego in the Kantian sense is in the thinking now occurring is incarnate. You see, it is, I would say, perfectly embodied or absolutely embodied, right? And in that sense, we'll go back to something Ali was saying before in her words. I forget how you phrase it, but in other words, there's no way of that I which is constructing the world, there's no way for it to be removed or disengaged from the activity of construction for the simple reason that it doesn't have the luxury of abstraction in any sense of the word, certainly not of self-abstraction. There's no time out, as I say, I think, somewhere. Right? It doesn't have the luxury of not being totally active, right?
So there's no Derridian Lacanian unconscious.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
The entire universe of well, I mean, obviously those guys are involved in their essential project is the critique of presence,
right?
And so you seem to go along with that to some extent.
Yes, but what you just said reminded me right away of Sartre. And Sartre's thoroughgoing critique in Being and Nothingness of psychoanalysis.
Well, that's why you have, I mean, the prehistory of that battle is the battle between Levi-Strauss and Sartre over exactly this question of the ontology of structures.
Right. But so I would say, going back to
you're on Sartre's side of.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So in other words, we're not. I don't know why we're not doing it. We have to do that sometimes. But Sartre. What is the truth of Sartre? Right. Well, the truth in Sartre that is brought forward, so to speak, right, or is not left behind, is precisely his denial of the unconsciousness of the unconscious.
I know, but it seems,
and his assertion, which is, by the way, his motive for denying it. His motive for denying it is quite philosophical, and that is, it's his way of insisting upon the absolute responsibility of the and freedom of the person. Now, I say absolute responsibility and freedom within the limitations of the futility of it all.
It seems like that exactly the fact that there's another generation of this battle. It didn't really get resolved there. Because the way in which Lacan and particularly Derrida critique Levi-Strauss, and the way in which the kind of critique of presence arises there, I'm not sure that there's I haven't done this myself, I can't really say this, but I'm not sure that the Sartrean position survives the Derridian position.
Well, it may not, but I would say, not having gone through that particular exercise either, I would say in principle that if it doesn't survive, it's due to the rootedness of Sartre's critique in self-consciousness and subjectivity. Yeah, that's right.
Well, maybe, but the way in which the weird, I won't say mysterious, I want to dignify it with that, but the weird existence of non-presential ontology, that there's a new layer to ontology which is not capable of being represented as some kind of presence, and absolutely so, in the way Derrida attacks again and again and again, text after text, position after position. It seems to me that's it's pretty formidable. So there's a danger that the assertion simply of the the creativity of this presence without this presencing, or whatever you want to do with it, creativity. I mean, you seem to be okay with that, without an unconscious, without any gap. It seems to me that that's in danger.
Endangered?
Yeah, it's in danger. It's in danger
Of what?
Of succumbing to the critical process of the Derridian acids. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I could undertake it, but
all right.
this is we've been talking about this since the beginning,
right.
but we don't know that.
Okay. Well,
sorry.
it's okay. I can't actually respond to it. Take us off in another.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just that your claim to have reversed it or have passed.
Not reversed it.
To pass a situation that's beyond the Derridian position. Right. It's just like one needs to see that.
Okay. Well, that's fair.
You do an okay job when you take on Derrida at a certain point, but there seems to be more than that there.
Okay. Okay.
Can I ask one quick question?
Sure.
Just as you said, ego is the act of construction, and two words that have come up a couple times today and before are being and unity. Mm-hmm. And I always, or most of the time, fall into the trap of the kind of totalizing mm-hmm. notion, the past historical, ways of using those two mm-hmm. words. Mm-hmm. Is that act that Alia was speaking of, and then you kind of mm-hmm. crystallized into ego being the act of construction? Mm-hmm. Are we to be, in the thinking now occurring, is this notion of unity mm-hmm. inherent, or is unity somehow that act itself of the ego creating? Because otherwise I don't understand how to think of unity, because it falls... No. And I'm looking for something that is going to be some kind of concept.
Yeah, I would say, if I'm hearing you correctly, you could say that unity is the... is the act of the I, act of the ego. Or another way of putting this is that the unity, therefore, is not unity in the thinking now occurring is, we've said this in different ways, but we didn't focus on unity, I guess, right? In other words, it's not at all a static notion. Right? So you might almost say unity is the unifying act, to say. But now we have to be careful, because the unity or the unification or the unifying activity of a creative ego, right, is again not, however, a totalizing activity, right? So you have to.
It's a momentary activity.
Well, it's a momentary activity, but it's a momentary activity that is actually related to other momentary activities of other world-creating egos.
So then how do we understand unity on that level, then?
We understand unity on that level as polyontological. Okay. Yeah. As I'm tempted to say, as using traditional language, a kind of de facto unity, right? It's which is not, in the context of the thinking now occurring, is not a bad word. Fact, to say, what does fact come from? It's very interesting. It comes from factum again. It comes from facio. It comes to make. See, now we have this static idea of the fact.
Right.
Now,
Given.
as a given, do you see? And the fact is what has been made to be. Maybe not made to be present, do you see? Forget the present part, but a fact is what has been constructed, has been factumed. Factotumed, right? What is it, right? So is that okay?
Yep,
so and if you want to get a historical hook to swing from, you can go back to my friend Peirce, whose level of fact is his level of secondness, which, if, remember, the contrary to fact condition in pragmatism is, if you could isolate secondness, qua secondness, from firstness and thirdness, which you cannot actually do, then you would have fact as absolute adamantine immutability. Do you see? But Peirce's whole notion is that that's what fact would be, apart from the fact, pardon the expression, that it is always in the context of the, what's the word he uses, the tendency of habit-taking tendency of the logos, which in turn is only able to condition factuality by virtue of the always unexhausted spontaneity of firstness. All right. So Peirce's version of this is that you would say the pedestrian mind, the science worshipping mind, would say that, well, there's one thing we can be sure of, and by some of these pedestrians are in the scientific world. We have the laws of science, and they're facts, right? And Peirce says not only are the laws of science not facts in that hard and unchanging sense, but the whole point that Peirce wants to make is, even if it's very imperceptible to us, it's not just that there are violations of the laws from time to time, but the laws are not perfectly consistent because the laws have evolved. Well, if the laws have evolved, in principle, they're continuing to evolve. Now, they're evolving at a very small and practically imperceptible rate, right? But so there are no hard Davidic clarity is 0.000113777. And then I give you a footnote that tells us to go back to 413, which is nice because that's the section which I had postponed a meeting or two back because it related to something even earlier, okay? And what it relates to, if you just look at 412 and 413, I think we can quickly scan that and get the sense of where this number is coming from originally, all right? What I'm doing there on 412 and 413, in the context of another level of critique of Altizer, is I'm taking Altizer's notion that the I am is I am not, which was quoted earlier in the text and so forth, and now I'm weaving that into the mathematical linguistic analysis of the Hebrew, and I've taken the notion of presence and absence, which he introduces in his text, and again I've woven that into this, and I've set up, as is my wont, a proportion, all right, in which I'm there on the bottom half of 412. I am not dash P. I am dash P. And what I'm doing there is, I think I allude to right above it there, the positive negative pattern PP plus NP plus PN plus NN, which you'll find in in section 3.1, identified as the universal form of all logical statements. I think I mentioned to you in a totally different context the rabbi's version of this so they could remember it easily. 4 kinds of students: those who are very slow to learn, and when they learn, they forget it immediately. And then there are those who are slow to learn, but they don't forget. And then there are those who are very quick to learn, but they forget. And then there are those who are not at all slow to learn and never forget. So that's the variation of the pattern, right? You fall into one of those 4 kinds, and you can self-identify later on. Okay, so I'm using that pattern, and I'm taking. All right, so so in other words, what I'm really doing, you might say, in my own mind, is I'm kind of exploring the logical possibilities of relating the opposition, the coincidence of opposites in Altizer's text, that I am becomes I am not, right? That the primordial Godhead actually puts itself out of existence, and I'm putting that in the context of this purely abstract logical analysis, and I'm taking the I am part as a P, logical P, and so the PP, and then I am not is an N, so that's NP, you see, and then I am is positive again, so that's PN. So I got, you follow what I'm doing? PP.
Well, I don't see how you wrote it differently. You've got I am as
Did
P,
I write it
and I
differently?
am not as P, and then I am as N, and then I am not as N. If that's what, if I'm looking in the right place.
You're looking in the right place, but I'll tell you, it's tricky. I don't think I made a mistake here. In other words, I am not is I've appended a la Altizer to what otherwise would be a positive I am. I've appended in his language the not. So I'm saying I am not is the second place in the logical series. That's an N. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then it's associated, however, with the P, which is NP is part of the second slot in the logical sequence of the four alternatives.
Oh, I see what
you got it? Okay. And then and then what I'm doing here now is I'm taking advantage of the earlier established, some of which are reprised at the top of 412, but it goes back to the Maimonides section, where the notion of I am, mathematical version of that is 0.40, right? So I'm translating, in other words, this back into the Hebrew mathematics, and I'm getting, therefore, the mathematical equivalent of what I've got up there in a logical way in the bottom of 412, and then I say the proven unity of this proportion is 1. Now, here's an example of where we get 1, which would make an ordinary mathematician very happy. Thank God we have Leahy gives us a proportion in which, when you multiply the extremes and divide by the multiplication of the means, you'll get 1. And so in this case, you do, okay? But of course, this unity now it's not automatic. We might not have gotten 1, you know what I'm saying? In other words, and so what the unity we're talking about here is not this bare, abstract, ordinary mathematical unity, but we must understand, especially in the context, this is the unity of the Godhead as it is understood, do you see, in the context of the thinking now occurring, all right? Now, but the reason I go slow, in other words, the reason I spell out what the product of the extremes and the means is, which turns out to be, in this case, identical, where at the bottom of page 412, where minus 0.0106666 is the negative identity, that is, it's the identity with the minus sign in front of it, of I am that I am. In other words, the rational product of the Hebrew of the original phrase that we broke up following Maimonides' syntax explanation of it, the actual rational product of the Hebrew is 0.1066, all right? So we've got the situation in which divided by the rational product of truth at the top of page 413 gives us the negative, gives us the positive form of these two negatives, all right? Now, of course, you know when you multiply two negatives, you get a positive, so eventually this is going to work out. It's not going to, the negatives have a transitional role here. In any event, I say the rational product of this proportion, all right, now, so I've given you the proof form, which gives me 1. The rational product of that same proportion over on 412 is 225, where 225 is the identity of breadless, the Hebrew for breadless, and absolute perception, conception, and absolute to appear, to reveal, while all right, so let me just pause there. So I'm saying I have 3 ways, as it were, simultaneously, which to read the significance of the mathematics here. And that when I take the rational product of this logical transcription of what otherwise remains the undefined and inconceivable Altizerian death of God situation, when I shed, as it were, when I see it through the lens of proportionality, when I see it through the lens of rationality, when I see it through the lens of a logicality which he eschews in principle, you see, I now see here that what this proportion tells me qua identity, rational product. In Hebrew, it's a notion of the breadless, which is indifferently the notion of perception, the notion of to appear, right? Or you might say in the philosophical sense there of appearance, in the active sense, right? Like essay is to exist actively. And then when I take the integral product of the same proportion, I get 0.0256, which is the identity of the Hebrew for meal offering, which has a biblical reference there, as I think I give in footnote 120, the sacrifice eaten by Aaron and his descendants inside the holy place in the form of unleavened bread. All right. Now, why am I doing this? Well, way back when in Novitas Mundi, I have a whole section, Gamma, the whole point of which is that what we're really dealing with here in this otherwise undefinable, inconceivable new world, this otherwise undefinable, inconceivable new humanity, I'm saying there, and now I'm reiterating here in a more detailed and technical sense. What we're dealing with here is the Eucharist of existence itself. All right? And when I do the mathematical linguistic reading of the otherwise blank death of God, you see, when it now becomes definable and intelligible in this context, what I see is that I have here that the perception, the appearance that I've just been otherwise identifying with the window, the appearance, which is the reality, which is the schema, do you say? That appearance is not just the root idea of the unleavened bread, which is the Eucharist sacramentally, do you say? The unleavened bread is the form of the Eucharist, right? So the unleavened bread, but notice in the Hebrew, this unleavened bread is breadless. This is a linguistical, mathematical rendition of what Thomas Aquinas would call transubstantiation. In other words, here I have existence. All right. So what's the analogy here? The analogy is to the Eucharist. The analogy is to the fact that in the consecration of the bread and wine, this is the pre-Kantian move that Thomas makes. It's really brilliant, right? I mean, he explained what's brilliant about it. He didn't create the doctrine. That's not the brilliant part. The brilliant part is he explains it scientifically. That is, he says, the substance has changed, but the appearances are there, and the basic appearance, as I pointed out to you, is dimensive quantity, res extensa. Okay, so his scientific conscience. He can't explain why it happens. God does it, right? It's like Descartes. He can't explain how come the body and soul are so well united. Descartes can't explain that either, right? But nevertheless, if I buy the bit, I buy the premise, and the premise requires Thomas qua thinker to explain to himself how it is that the appearances which have lost their original substance to which they corresponded originally, how is it that they cohere? Do you see? And he says, well, they cohere in extension, to use the Cartesian phrase. They cohere as in a subject, he says. You see? As in a subject, they cohere in dimensive quantity. Right? So another level of what we were talking about earlier, I said that the self inside the transcendental consciousness of Descartes is the reflection of the not essentially doubted res extensa. He didn't say so, and so the separation, right? Okay. If Thomas was using Cartesian language, he would have said that the smell, the taste, the other qualities of the bread and wine, the substance of which is gone, they inhere as in a subject in res extensa, if he spoke Cartesian. What I'm getting at is the quantitative foundation of the world of time and space is in the mode of subject corresponding. You see, subject. Why was subject excluded by Augustine in the De Trinitate from an adequate understanding of the simplicity of the Godhead? It was because where I have subject, I have predicate. Where I have subject and predicate, I have a lack of simplicity. All right. So the lack of simplicity is reflected already in Thomas, right? Pre-modern Thomas, not intentionally so, but de facto. In his understanding that the foundation of the world of appearances is not a human subject, but it is a logical subject of which the other qualities are predicated. Quantity is the subject of which qualities are predicated. Do you see? And the analog of that subjectivity of the structure of the external world, which is what? Which is, you see, look at that. So what's the problem with Thomas's explanation and Descartes? I don't want to lay it all on Descartes, right? Well, the problem is that both beginning in Thomas, the world of appearances lacks simplicity. Otherwise, he wouldn't be predicating the qualities of quantity. You see what I'm saying? He wouldn't be making the distinction to begin with, the uncritical distinction, I would think, right? The uncritical. It didn't occur to him to doubt it. Huh? Okay, between quality and quantity, between quantum and quality, as in the language of the earlier part of this text. Okay, so it's really of a piece. It's really of a piece. Okay, so now what was it? Oh, so all right, so that's what I'm doing back there on 413, 412, and I'm doing some more mathematics, and that brings me on 414. I get this number, and what is this number in the middle of 414? Right? It's the integral product of this. Oh, I know. I have to slow down here a little bit. At the bottom of 413, you have the same basic proportion that you have over there we started with on 412, but I've rearranged the order, and I've rearranged it in the minimum order. And I'm saying there, in other words, instead of the logical order, instead of the 1, 2, 4, 3 order, which I'm ascribing, again, because qua relationship. Remember, Chuck asked last time, what was the basis for saying that the Hebrew word for being was in the logical order? And the answer, I don't know whether I said it as precisely as I should have said it to you. I was thinking about this. I want to make this very clear. The basis for ascribing to being, that Hey, Vav, Yud, Hey, being in the logical order, whereas Yahweh, the Hebrew Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, the basis for calling one the logical order and the other the minimum order is that when I look at the four letters as they lie, I notice the difference between the two orders is that the third letter in the Hebrew for being is the first letter in the Hebrew for Yahweh. So in the order, you got it? So where in my logical chapter, where in 3.1 do I have a relationship such that the third place in one order of four elements is the first place in another? The only place I have where that relationship holds, that's why I go back to the thing about it's all about relations. The only place I have that is the relationship between the logical order, 1, 2, 4, 3, third number 4, and the minimum order 4, third, you see, comes to the front. 1, 2. So it's not even, I think I spoke too quickly last time, it's not even simply attributing to the Hebrew for being the logical order, but only doing so in its relationship to the Hebrew for Yahweh, which is not arbitrary in the sense that it's not something I have decided to do. That's the way it lies in the tradition, do you see? And so when now I'm equipped with this logical analysis in 3.1, I can now shine the light of that logical analysis, and now it makes sense to me. See, now it makes sense to me that this particular substitution. Okay, so what I'm saying is analogous to that, I'm doing the same kind of transcription of the proportion on 412 into a minimum order proportion on 413, and then I'm doing the similar kinds of operations, getting the proof product, which, by the way, happily turns out to be identical, only now it's the positive form, you see, now it's not in the negative on the top of page 414. The proof of the minimum order is positive, not negative, which reminds me of something very, very, very difficult in the logical chapter, what I call the Logic 3.1, where I talk about the transcendence of the negative meta identity. To say it's taken up and left behind in some sense by the positive meta identity, and the transformation of this particular proportion gets rid of the negative sign. You say in the 0.106666. Okay, but here's what I want to get to, because this takes us into today's assignment in a rather substantial way. In the middle of 414, after I did the rational product. Oh, and that's nice, right? The rational product is identically in the minimum order. It's identically the proof product 1. But now I do the integral product, and I get this really weird number. Now you have to. I'm speaking here historically, anecdotally, to show you how this is not a setup. Okay, so I get this number, and it's an interesting number, but it doesn't do anything for me. Okay, I mean it's not exactly neat. You know what I mean? It's not like 3600 or 24. Or, you know what I mean? It's kind of a strange thing, but I got to go with it because everything else is working, so I got it there. And so I begin to notice, and won't go through all the details of this, but actually this number turns out to operate. Now, we already did some of the following last time. We're kind of backwards in the text. But to make a long story short, it turns out that this number, in its various incarnations in the analysis of the Hebrew, works around the notion of unity, where unity is already polyontological because it's unity in the context of society, sociability, the relationship among persons, all right? So the notion of society as a unified whole in the context of the thinking now occurring of essentially, for want of a better term, in persons existing independently in existence, right? Who's right related one to the other de facto, and therefore really, you say, but not out of any not out of an ontological necessity to conform to a pre-existing arrangement. Okay. Anyway, so I did that, and I kept it through various manipulations because it was working there. I'll give you an example on page 419. We did this last time. I didn't note this particular thing when I was doing the synthesis thing last time. The leap, the synthesis, and so forth, having to do with the manipulation of the mathematical manipulation of being and Yahweh and so forth and so on. Notice that this number, which I don't particularly care for, I have nothing against it. Okay, it just doesn't turn me on. It appears again there, for example, at the end of where we left off last time, I think, or maybe we didn't. Yeah, 419 there, where it's the divisor of 0.644, which is the synthesis, the leap, and so forth and so on, that produces a number which, again, identifies the window with the absolute between and so forth a little bit up in the text, all right? So what I'm saying to you is this number's working, but it's working, but by itself it's not meaning anything. You know what I'm saying? I got it, but and it fits, and it's illuminating other relationships, but what is it in itself? Well, you won't believe it, but on page 426, I took 3 months off, okay, and I painted my house. At the end of the top paragraph on 326, I had it, okay. You got problems. I had it, right? So I thought, and besides my,
You started looking for the integral product of the names.
and besides my house needed to be painted, so the combination. You know, my mind was exhausted, and I needed to paint the house. All right, good. I'll paint the house.
3 months.
Well, I'm very careful. I may be exaggerating. It seemed like 3 months. It was a long time. It wasn't 2 days. Whatever it was, 2 or 3 months. It was a big house. And and then I go back to the text. And this is the first thing I discovered here. First of all, the numbers pops up again right out of the blue. But now it's going to have a place, because what I discover on the bottom paragraph of 426 is that when I related that number to pi, I got this number, which was brand new to me, 2.7648 times 10 to the fourth, right? So 27,648. And then I noticed very quickly, as I point out there, that the integral product of that, all right, so in other words, the first thing I did, I took this number and related it to pi. It gives me approximately 27,648, right? And I thought, well, that's interesting. I don't recognize that number either. And just looking at the number and taking its integral product, I noticed that its integral product is 1/3 of itself, right? It just is the fact. Now, that was the first time, after doing all the integral products I had been doing, the first time I had found such a neat relationship between an integral product and itself. By the way, although we have discussed, and the number 82944 appears earlier in the text, I hadn't found that number yet. So it's a little misleading, the order of the text, to say. And so I said, well, here is a number, 27,648, the integral product of which is 1/3 of itself. I said just to myself, well, I wonder what 27,648 is 1/3 of. That's all I did. So that's easy. I multiplied by 3, and I got 82944. That's the first time I came across the number. And I said, well, as any good thinking now occurring person would do, I said, well, what's the integral product of 82944? And I was just blown out of the water to find that the integral product of 82944 was 82944. So here I had two numbers that had a very special relationship with one another, you see. One of them had an integral product which was 1/3 of itself, and the number, was 1/3 of a number whose integral product was identically itself.
These numbers have been sitting around for about 10 billion years looking for a niche to become.
Looking for the thinking now. I told you.
You've been scouted by these numbers.
Right. That's
Stalked.
right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, they have been waiting. They have been waiting expectantly for the thinking now occurring to occur,
Well,
actually occur.
You're a bloody number niche.
Okay. So there on the top of page 327 is just laying out that in a kind of technical way or whatever, mathematical formula. Says the same thing as I've just said and showing it out there. And then, and by the way, so that number, I'm associating in my mind the original number that was a problem for me, the 113777. That turns out to be, as I say, that's part of this special set of numbers. In other words, what it turns out at the top of 427 is that the integral product of 27648 is 81. And 81 is 113.777th of itself. Am I phrasing it right in English? Okay, in other words, 81 goes into 9216, 113.777 times. Okay, so this number that came out in the context...
You're in trouble.
This number that comes out in the context, well, you could say I'm in trouble or I'm in luck, okay? Or I'm in providence, right? This number that comes out in the context of the analysis of I am that I am...
There are a lot of things that operate these providences. So
all right. That comes out in that context. That comes out in the same context of the breadless, unleavened bread, what I'm calling the Eucharist of existence itself. Remember, the whole thrust, going back to Novitas Mundi, of the thinking now occurring, is that what we're dealing with here is an incarnational thinking, the ultimate, the here and now, ultimate, final clarification of consciousness, affected in effect by the incarnation in history. And that the form of the world is in fact Eucharistic. Right? And when I say form in the context of thinking now occurring, I'm not distinguishing form from substance. I'm saying this. All right. Okay. So now I've got these, and I've got a whole new angle on this, building up in the earlier part of this chapter, and now it comes together here in these three numbers, of which this Eucharistic number, if I can call it that, or I can call it the I am that I am number. Do you see? Turns out to be what I want to say, like the bottom line number of this unique relationship of 27648 and 82944 and their various integral products. Yeah.
I just get sort of overwhelmed by these relationships that sort of just seem to flow out of antiquity. Which came first? The letters or the numbers? I mean, the numbers seem to be assigned very logically, starting with the beginning of the alphabet and going down the alphabet.
Well, within reason. I mean, certainly the first 10 numbers follow that way.
Well, no, I mean, even from then on, it's the same type of application to a letter of a number that they had in the ancient Egyptian numeric
Right, but there are variations between the Greek and the Hebrew. Slight variations, and they make a difference.
But what puzzles me is how can Yahweh and being just magically produce the same result?
But this is a question the thinking now occurring doesn't ask, because we don't have time for that question. Here we are, and what we have to do is what's going on now, and what we're seeing now. If we look back and say, well, how is that possible? I don't know. I think it's a kind of an antiquarian study.
But I think it's probably got to do with the actual structure of the difference between the rational product and the integral product. When you have four things that are permutations of each other, you probably would find that the same thing happens with other letters.
I mean, your point...
Well, but why? I think the question, to be more concrete, what I'm here, I'm not sure this is right.
If you took an arbitrary set of four letters and turned them into the what's it, the minimal form, that you had one and you shifted the positions of them, what would happen?
Look, let's make it real concrete. Yeah. Just quickly jump ahead to 444, which is a note at the end of the paper in which I lay out kind of like the proof of the uniqueness of these numbers, which I told you was subsequently
Yeah.
verified by some mathematicians.
Yeah.
But notice, look at this. Now this is here. You're asking me this question, so I'm going to. You tell me. In footnote 2 there on page 444, I say the technical mathematical term for the fee ratio is the golden section, which we discussed, right? That unique division of the line. There's a term for that in Greek, and it's still, by the way, it's still used by mathematicians as a technical term for the golden section. They don't, it's a little jazzy way of putting it, but the technical term, going back to Euclid, is the extreme and mean ratio. All right. Now there's the Greek for the extreme and mean ratio. Well, guess what? Guess what? Using the methodology of the thinking now occurring, it turns out that the integral product of the Greek term for the extreme and mean ratio is the product of 1 times 784 times 82944 times 10 to the 30th.
Incredible.
Well, do you see what the point is? There's nothing incredible in the thinking now occurring. What do you mean? It would be incredible if we had to explain it
Well, that was
self-consciously. It's just the fact. There it is, and it's always been there. And yes, it may be that it could not have been seen before there were the eyes to see it, before there was the form of consciousness.
The entire internal structure of everything is changing in every moment. So it wasn't there before.
Well, you could put it that way too. Yes. Okay, but I'm conceding Bill's perspective. He wants to think in the past. I'm making a concession to the extent to which we look back. If we think we can do that.
But you're reaching into the past to bring out these relationships. And anyway, the second half of my question was going to be, how did the Greek relate to the Hebrew? And now I see.
Well, yeah. So the same methodology is applied to the Greek. The values of the letters many would be the equivalent. In other words, the Greek mu and mem in Hebrew would both have a value of 40, but it gets a little tricky because the Greek R and the Hebrew R, resh and ro, don't have the same value in Greek and Hebrew. And so it's very close, similar methodology on their part, but not identical because of...
I printed these out from the internet.
Okay. Oh, the Hebrew values. Okay. Well, let me go back to where we were then. I just give you that as a kind of illustration. Oh, and then I give you... Oh, well, let me just finish that. I'm on that footnote. It's so nice. And then Jesus speaks somewhere in the Gospels of the foundation of the universe. And the integral product of that is also this same product of these three unique numbers times, in this case, 10 to the 16th. And then he says famously in John 8:12, I am the light of the world, of the universe. And that, again, is another example of the use of it. Now, it's not just... And also the whole premise of the mathematical paper, which I've abstracted from all this other analysis, just the pure, sheer uniqueness of this set of numbers, the point of the title being that this set of numbers equals the first 9 digits of our decimal system, the first 9 natural numbers, their factorial product divided by their sum squared. So I don't think it's a reach to say that these three numbers are not only unique, but they are foundational mathematically. They are related to the foundations of our decimal system, and therefore it's interesting to see them related to the foundational notion of the golden section mathematically, related biblically, theologically, if you want, to the foundation of the universe in the mouth of Jesus and to his self-identification as the light of the universe.
Have you done, at least these Bible...
I have done no comparative studies.
No, not comparative. Yeah, well, that's the trick, is that there are today, because of the Bible code nonsense,
right,
these guys in Yale and in Jerusalem who've actually figured out how to ask the question about the probability of these kinds of...
Well, if they have any light to shed on this, I would be happy to hear from them, but I feel no need to seek them out. So you can sick them on me.
No, not me.
Okay.
It's not.
I think they're doing something else. They're doing
not
something.
one of the blessings.
They're
of my
doing
life
something.
that I happen to know about it.
They're doing something statistical, fundamentally, I think.
Yeah, of course.
Right, and therefore they're into probability. But the thinking now occurring is beyond probability. It just.
Well, but it's not beyond saying aha.
But then it gets into questions that are kind of out of bounds.
Yeah, but I'm saying as soon as you get excited about it,
Right.
you're into it's a probability.
No, I'm excited. I'm not excited about how unlikely it is that it appears. That's not what's exciting me. What's exciting me is that this makes sense. I'm not reflecting on how unlikely it is that it appears. It fits. That's what I'm excited about. It fits. It works. I'm a practical guy. It works. It advances the thought.
Yeah.
It clarifies the understanding.
It's no different from any other thing that would fit, which would be.
If it fits, it fits. I have no problem with that. I'm easy.
Okay.
You got something else that'll fit? Bring it on. Okay.
Don't say it's not
Chocolate
poetry.
cake.
Don't say it's not poetry though.
Don't say poetry and art are something different in the context of the thinking now
Okay,
occurring
cool.
than knowing.
Cool, man.
Cool, man.
Okay, so now we have a few minutes to do this right, I think. On page 430 and 31. So we've anticipated this a number of times verbally. Toward the bottom of the page, I say about 5 lines up in the text. Now, for the first time, this is, speaking of unity, this is the unity of the circle. Now, of course, we understand the unity of the circle here is like that circle, that discontinuous circle, right? So the unity here has a contextual meaning. Of the circle measured ex abysso. Oh, and by the way, I've just said the line before, I should have quoted it, that the problem before now is not only that there was no essential doubt, but the problem immediately before now, in the case of Altizer, was as close as it comes, qua potentiality to the thinking now occurring. What's lacking in Altizer, as he himself says, his words are, he can't define it and he can't conceive of it. I'm making it simple. He can't measure it. You see? He lacks the measure. And to go back to the question about number some months back, and the reference to wisdom in Augustine back on page 524, note 98, where he quotes wisdom, all things, you have created all things in measure, number, and weight. Right? According to measure, number, and weight. Well, measure is the first. I mean, if you don't have measure, you don't even get to number. Right? In other words, the opening requisite for understanding the intelligibility is to have the measure. You see, and in that sense, the measure, the metric in modern scientific language, that's the key. That is, if you want, the foundation. So in a certain sense, the minimum order, the measure, the foundation. These are different ways of tackling the same central notion that we have the Thomistic phrase for the Aristotelian notion of the intelligible species is just that in Latin. It's the intelligible species. But the intelligible species, remember, Thomas says it's a similitude. It's a likeness of the object, not the. See, in Aristotle, when the mind knew the object, there was that identity of the act of knowing was a substantial identity, or if you want, a substantial unity. But it was not. But in Thomas, no, it's not substantial. He anticipates Kant. Kant's critique of Descartes. You think you had your substance in mind? No. That was your appearance you were certain of. Qua appearance, right? Not substance. He and Thomas are on the same wavelength there. Absolutely on the same wavelength. But Descartes is more Aristotelian at that point, right? The thinking now occurring is going to have it both ways. It's going to have its cake and eat it. It's going to say that what we now have is the intelligible species, which, all right, we don't want to throw Thomas out, is a similitude. It's a likeness. It's a schema. Right? See? It's not in his context substance, but now we have that schema, that intelligible species, and that is what the thing actually known is. All right. In other words, so now we have the absolutely intelligible species. That's what it comes down to. You see? Okay. So now I'm saying here. Now for the first time, this is the unity of the circle measured ex abysso. And then I create a little saying here, which I kind of like. I am this beginning. I'm kind of, again, synthesizing a lot of the stuff that's gone before in a more technical way. I am this beginning, dead center, absolutely everywhere. Now, this is going to be expanded later on in today's assignment. We're not going to get to it tonight, but we'll pick up there.
Are you quoting somebody there?
Yeah, I'm quoting The Thinking Now Occurring.
Oh.
I'm quoting The Thinking Now Occurring. It's The Thinking Now Occurring quoting itself, just laying it out there for you. This is the beginning of the circle, absolutely eliminating absolutely nothing from dead center. Not the original synthetic unity of apperception. Now that refers to the footnote, quotation from Heidegger, who's rehearsing the Kantian notion, okay, and dropping down to about 7 lines from the bottom of the footnote on page 430. As original synthetic unity of apperception, the ego is the fundamental ontological condition of all being. The basic determinations of the being of beings are the categories. I think Chuck was touching on this issue before. The ego is not, says Heidegger, speaking, now he's reading Kant, right? He's telling you what's in Kant. The ego is not one among the categories of beings, but the condition of the possibility of categories in general in Kant. Therefore, the ego does not itself belong among the root concepts of the understanding, as Kant calls the categories. Instead, as Kant expresses it, the ego is the vehicle of all concepts of the understanding. So it's the presupposition without which we could not have the categories of the understanding. But I think it's something like what you were saying. It's analogous in Kant to the role of the law of non-contradiction in Aristotle. In other words, in order to do any reasoning, I must posit in Aristotle that a thing cannot be and not be in the same respect at the same time. Notice how non-subjective that is, by the way. Notice how objective a presupposition that is. Do you see? Whereas the analogous presupposition in the Kantian subjective modern consciousness is not an objective statement like that about the objective world, because he's radically more deeply into subjectivity than Descartes. It's the radical presupposition is the I think. In other words, the radical, you might say the self is the radical presupposition of all the categories. Now, what is the thinking now occurring saying in this context, back into the text? Not the original synthetic unity of apperception a la Kant, but at the top of 431, the existence ex nihilo of the synthetic unity of perception, personality absolutely unconditioned, absolute personalitas transcendental. So it's just Latin for the transcendental personality, all right? But now absolutely so, and that's when I wrote, let me read a little more. The transcendental ego, in fact, one among the categories of being, so I'm saying it is now one among the categories. It is now, and this is what led me to what I already anticipated in class here, the notion of the incarnation of the trans. It is now come down into what in a Kantian sense would be the realm of understanding. You see? Which, by the way, is also the realm of science and of knowledge, and it is now not only one among the categories, right, which is already a concretization of the transcendental ego as over against this abstract presupposition. You see, the clarification goal of modern self-consciousness was to clarify that self-consciousness. I keep saying the one problem was that at the core there was this knot, K-N-O-T, that was a not, with a negative knot, and an opaqueness, you say, the removal of which is at least the condition for the ultimate clarification of the thinking now occurring. Okay, so the transcendental ego, in fact, one among the categories of being, and as such, the category, I should have probably italicized that, the category, but as such, the absolute elimination of subjectivity, of that subjectivity which it has been hitherto identified. So once, in the margin I now speak of the incarnation of the transcendental ego, then the transcendental ego doesn't have the luxury, as I was saying in another context earlier, to abstract itself from, to remove itself from what otherwise, if I can use a little Heraclitean language here, from the flux. It doesn't have the ability to abstract itself as a self does abstract itself inherently into a kind of state of quiescence. You see, a kind of restfulness, a kind of lack of motion, a kind of condition for a notion of objectivity, where objectivity is also a kind of stasis over against it. Now, this again has already been anticipated in pragmatism, and especially in Dewey, as I think we'll see. And if we don't see it, I'll bring it out when we get to Dewey, because Dewey is keen on a number of things, and one of them is a thoroughgoing critique. He has a nice book in this whole shelves full of books that Dewey wrote. I don't know how the hell he did it. But in one of them, it's called The Quest for Certainty.
He had tenure.
Yeah, I don't think that's it. It's some people just, I don't know what it is. He also had the advantage of being a kind of an Aristotelian position. He was not a beginner. He was a synthesizer in a very deep and important sense. But in any event, he makes the point that modernity is the undoing of but not the complete undoing from his point of view. And I'm saying, yeah, you're right, but you haven't gone far enough either. But in other words, the notion of reality as being a stasis, as being immovable, the unmoved mover, the eternally unchanging ideas. He had already learned from Peirce, as an American, that even the so-called Platonic ideas are evolving, you see. So he insists on that in other words, that reality and change are not incompatible. And thinking now occurring just wants to take that, as it were, absolutely all the way. But there is that. So already, in a certain sense, I guess I could say retrospectively, in some sense, there's something incarnational in pragmatism. Right? There's already that merging of being and nothing, the idea working itself out in time and space in such a way that certain tentative moves can actually come to a dead end in Peirce's cosmology. Okay, I pushed the clock. I'll stop. We'll meditate. We'll catch up. It's going to be a little easy to catch up now, and we'll go on next time. Use the forum.
Thank you.